December 1944. Somewhere in a tree line above the Ardennes forest, an American gunner is watching a road he cannot quite see through the snow. His hands have been on the same firing lever for 2 hours. His breath fogs the sight. He is 19 years old, and the gun he sits behind is one the German army does not yet know exists. Half a mile away, the Ardennes forest lies buried in fog and snow, so thick a man can lose his own hand at arm's length. Inside a King Tiger tank, a German commander watches the mist through his periscope. He is not yet 30. His crew has been told, again and again, for 6 months now, that no American weapon in Western Europe can hurt them. Not at 500 yards, not at 1,000, not at any distance where the human eye can still catch the flash before the shell arrives. He believes it. So does every tank commander in the column behind him. They are wrong. They have been wrong since October. Dozens of German crews have already learned this in burning wrecks scattered across Belgium and the German frontier, and most of them did not live long enough to warn anyone. Somewhere in the American lines, a new gun has been waiting in ambush for months. And German intelligence, in the winter of 1944, still does not know it exists. To understand how an entire army could miss a weapon already killing its tanks, we have to go back 4 months, to a quiet Norman lane where American shells were bouncing off German armor like stones on ice, and to a stubborn general in the Pentagon who was about to be proven fatally wrong 4 months earlier. August 7, 1944. The fog has not yet lifted from the hedgerows east of Mortain when the first shells begin to fall. Scenes like the one that follows played out dozens of times across the Mortain front that morning, in different fields and different lanes, wherever Shermans of the 743rd Tank Battalion and other supporting units met the German counterattack head-on. A Sherman tank from the 743rd shudders to a halt behind a row of apple trees. The battalion has been attached to the 30th Infantry Division, the Old Hickory Division, since Omaha Beach in June. By now, the crew knows this ground the way a man knows a room he has slept in for weeks. The bocage, the stone walls, the narrow lanes that swallow whole tanks and never give them back. 300 yards to the east, through gaps in the hedge, they can see them. Panthers, 5, maybe 6 of them, moving in column along the road from St. Barthélemy, the lead elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Hitler's own bodyguard, sent west by direct order of the Führer himself to cut the American breakout in half at Avranches. Inside the Sherman, the air smells of gun oil and sweat, and the damp canvas stink of a machine that has not been dry in weeks. The loader's hands are steady only because he has learned to make them steady. The gunner finds the lead Panther in his sight. The range card strapped to his thigh says 900 yards. He waits one breath, then another. He squeezes the trigger. The 75mm shell leaves the barrel and crosses the open ground in under a second. It strikes the Panther's frontal plate at a shallow angle. Then it bounces. A pale orange spark, a flash of bright metal spinning off into the mist, and the Panther keeps moving as if nothing has touched it at all. Somewhere behind the gunner's eyes, a small, cold thought arrives. The kind of thought he has learned not to say out loud anymore. That shot should have killed it. It did not. This is what American crews have been learning for 2 months. From the beaches of Normandy to the sunken lanes around Saint-Lô, they have been firing at German armor and watching their shells skip away like flat stones thrown across cold water. The Sherman commander shouts one word into the intercom. Back. The driver throws the transmission into reverse. The tracks bite into the wet earth and the tank lurches. But the engine that carried this crew from the beaches now feels like it is dragging a stone uphill. The Panther needs only a single shot in return. Its long 75 fires. The shell punches through the American tank's armor as if it were folded canvas. The Sherman burns. The fire finds the ammunition racks within seconds. And the men who are still moving inside know exactly how little time that gives them. Across the Mortain front that morning, the same scene repeats itself in different fields and different lanes, dozens of times before nightfall. Farmhouses that stood through 4 years of occupation now stand open to the sky, their stone walls scorched black around the edges. Cows lie dead in the pastures where the barrage caught them, and the smell of burning diesel drifts low over the hedgerows for miles. The Americans will hold their ground before the day is done. The German counterattack, an operation the enemy has named Lüttich, will fail, but it will not fail because American tanks have outfought German ones. It will fail because American artillery and American aircraft grind the attack to a halt from above and beyond it. Numbers and steel from the sky will do what the tank guns on the ground could not. The tank-to-tank arithmetic of that single day is what reaches the desks of officers far behind the line. The reports travel upward, from battalion to brigade, from brigade to division, until tired ordnance officers at 1st Army Headquarters read them one after another and find the same phrases repeating. Ammunition ineffective at observed range. Vehicle lost to a single round frontal aspect. Crew morale deteriorating. The men reading these reports do not need a metallurgist to explain the problem. The standard American gun, the workhorse weapon carried by every Sherman in Western Europe, cannot reliably defeat the frontal armor of a Panther beyond 500 yards. There is, however, a gun that could solve this. It already exists. It is being built in Detroit at this very moment. And for reasons that have nothing to do with engineering, it has not been allowed anywhere near a tank crew in France. To understand why, we have to go back nearly 3 years, to a quiet room inside the Pentagon, and to the officer who, more than any other single man, decided how the United States Army would fight enemy tanks. His name is Leslie J. McNair. In the summer of 1944, he is 61 years old, small, precise, almost professorial in manner. He wears thick glasses that have failed his eyes since the First World War. When a piece of artillery shell cost him part of his hearing and much of his peripheral vision, he does not raise his voice in meetings. He does not need to. Officers who have sat across the table from him describe a man who listens carefully, asks a small number of exact questions, and then delivers a decision that is very difficult to reverse. As commander of Army Ground Forces, every infantry division, every tank destroyer battalion, every training program in the United States Army passes across his desk at some point. He is regarded as brilliant. He is also, by nearly every account, immovable once he has settled on a doctrine. And by the summer of 1944, he has settled on this one. McNair believes tanks are not built to fight other tanks. Tanks, in his doctrine, exist to exploit a breakthrough, to race into the enemy's rear, to tear apart supply columns and shattered infantry. When enemy armor appears, it should be met by a separate class of vehicle entirely, a vehicle built for a single purpose. He calls these vehicles tank destroyers, fast, lightly armored, open-topped, designed to hide, ambush from concealment, fire 2 rounds, and vanish before the enemy can answer. The idea did not appear from nowhere. In the spring of 1941, watching German panzers overrun France in a matter of weeks, General George C. Marshall had ordered his staff to solve the anti-tank problem, and to solve it fast. An anti-tank planning board was formed under a lean-driven cavalry officer named Andrew D. Bruce. And behind Bruce, guiding the whole effort with quiet certainty, stood McNair that September. In the swamps and pine woods of Louisiana, the Army tested the new concept in the largest peacetime maneuvers it had ever run. 53 anti-tank battalions eventually took shape from those exercises. In November 1941, weeks before Pearl Harbor, the War Department made the arrangement permanent. The tank destroyer branch became its own arm of the Army, on equal footing with armor and artillery. A tank destroyer center rose from empty Texas prairie at what would soon be called Camp Hood. On paper, in a Pentagon office in 1941, the doctrine was elegant. By the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, it was falling apart. The Germans did not attack in the massed columns McNair's doctrine expected them to use. They defended in depth with infantry and dug in anti-tank guns. And when they counterattacked, they did it with Panthers that outranged and outgunned almost anything the Americans could bring against them. Earlier that summer, engineers inside the Ordnance Department had already put forward a proposal. Take a Sherman chassis, remove the 75, mount a 90mm gun in its place, a weapon powerful enough to punch through anything the Germans were fielding. McNair refused the idea outright. The existing gun, he insisted, was sufficient, and he had test data behind him. Trials conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1943 had shown American shells penetrating German armor at what the tables called adequate combat range. The numbers were there in ink, the columns lined up, the doctrine held, what those tests had not shown. What no one in the Ordnance Department discovered until German tanks actually arrived in France was that Panther armor had a face-hardened surface the American test plates did not possess. Shells that should have penetrated, instead shattered on impact. The Aberdeen data had been collected against steel that did not behave the way the real Panther steel behaved on a Norman battlefield. The doctrine was built on a flawed number, and McNair did not yet know it. This is the first turn in the story. Not treachery, not incompetence. A quiet mistake in a laboratory, one that no one in Maryland could have caught, and one that would cost American crews their lives from one hedgerow to the next, through the entire summer of 1944. And there is a second turn, buried inside the first. The gun McNair kept refusing was not new. It had been sitting, in plain sight, in the American arsenal for 4 years. In June 1938, more than 3 years before Pearl Harbor, the United States Army had issued a development contract for a new heavy anti-aircraft gun. Aircraft had changed. They flew higher and faster than the guns built a generation earlier could reach. The result was the 90mm gun M1. Standardized in early 1940, improved to the M1A1 in May 1941, deployed by the thousand across coastal batteries from Long Island to Hawaii. By the middle of the war, it was firing at Japanese bombers over the Pacific and at V1 flying bombs over Antwerp 22 hours a day, until the gun tubes wore out and had to be replaced. Somewhere inside the Ordnance Department in the early summer of 1942, an engineer noticed something almost by accident. The same velocity that drove a 90mm shell miles into the air would, if the gun were simply pointed level at the ground, drive that same shell through nearly any tank then in existence. The 90 had been, by a quirk of physics nobody had asked for, the most powerful anti-tank weapon in the American arsenal all along. It had simply been aimed at the wrong kind of target. The proposal reached McNair. It was reasonable. It was buildable. The gun already existed. The chassis already existed. The industrial base already existed. All that was needed was permission. McNair said no, not because the 90 was a bad gun. He knew it was a fine gun, but because he did not believe the war would need it. His tank destroyer doctrine called for speed, for ambush, for hit and run. A heavier gun meant a heavier vehicle, and a heavier vehicle meant a slower one. And what use, he asked, was a slow tank destroyer? The whole point of the branch was to move faster than what it hunted. There was a logic to this. There is almost always a logic to a decision that costs other men their lives. It just was not a logic that could survive contact with a Panther. Inside the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Andrew Bruce had by 1943 come around to the other side of the argument. He wanted a lighter, faster vehicle too, the machine that would eventually become the M18 Hellcat. But he also wanted the 90. He wanted both. He wanted anything he could put in the field that would tell his crews they were no longer outmatched. He argued for it. He put it in memos. He raised it in meetings. And McNair, quietly, patiently, and immovably, held the line. The proposal did not die. Nothing in a bureaucracy that large ever really dies. It moved sideways. It moved through the Ordnance Department under its own separate authority. In October 1942, engineers began the design of a new tank destroyer built specifically around the 90. The prototype was designated T-71. It was completed in March 1943 and tested at Aberdeen. It passed everything. In November 1943, it was accepted for limited procurement. In June 1944, days after the Normandy landings, it was standardized and given its production designation, 90mm gun motor carriage M36. Later, someone in the Ordnance Department's publicity office would try to attach a nickname to it, Jackson, after Stonewall Jackson. It did not stick with the men who crewed it. To them, it was simply the 90 or the 36. But even standardized, even in production, even rolling off the assembly line at Grand Blanc, Michigan, in the plants of the Fisher Body Division of General Motors, the vehicle still could not reach the men who needed it. There was no 90mm ammunition supply chain in Europe yet. The crews had to be trained, the doctrine had to be adjusted, and at every step of the way, the same quiet resistance from the same institutional certainty slowed the process another week, another month. Meanwhile, in the hedgerows of Normandy, American crews kept dying in Shermans and M10s that could not answer the guns pointed back at them. On August 7th, at Mortain, one of them was already burning behind a row of apple trees while the Panther that killed him drove on toward the horizon. 200 miles to the east, in a small stone office where the paperwork of the Ordnance Department was translated into shipping manifests, A clerk stamped an approval on a form authorizing the first M36 tank destroyers to cross the Atlantic. The date on the stamp was August 7, 1944, the same day, almost the same hour, that the Sherman burned at Mortain. The gun that could have saved that crew was, on that morning, already on its way. It would arrive at Cherbourg 6 weeks later. Some of the men who read those reports at First Army headquarters would still be alive to see it. Many of the men who fired the reports had not lived long enough to be counted. The story of the M36 is not the story of a wonder weapon. It is not the story of a machine that won the war on its own. It is the story of a single decision, held for too long by a single man of undeniable ability, and of a smaller, quieter decision by an engineer no one remembers, who once glanced sideways at an anti-aircraft gun aimed at the sky and thought, quietly, without fanfare, that if you tipped it down, it might reach the ground as well. By the time the first M36 rolled off a landing ship at Cherbourg in the last week of September 1944, Leslie McNair was already dead. He had been dead for 2 months. He had been killed, in circumstances that no one in Washington had thought possible, by his own Air Force, in the war he helped design, and the doctrine that had blocked the 90 was about to be tested against the machine it had refused to expect. The Ardennes was 90 days away. The King Tiger commander in the fog did not yet know his name, but the gun that would find him was already at sea. July 25, 1944. 200 miles to the northwest of Mortain, the largest carpet bombing operation in American history is about to begin. Its name is Cobra. Its purpose is to blast a corridor through the German line near the village of Marigny and pour First Army armor into the open country beyond. For 6 weeks, the Americans have been trapped in the bocage, 6 weeks of hedgerow after hedgerow, each one a small fortress of dirt and root and stone, 6 weeks of dying by inches. General Omar Bradley has decided the only way forward is a single, catastrophic blow from the air. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair has crossed the English Channel to watch. He has no operational command in Normandy. As Chief of Army Ground Forces, he trained the men now digging in along the front lines. He wrote the doctrine that put them there. He is 61 years old, half deaf, half blind, and by every measure of common sense, he should be sitting in his office in Washington, reading the reports as they come in. He is not. He has come forward, into a slit trench near the village of Chapelle-en-Juger, to see the attack unfold with his own eyes. He was there the day before, on the 24th, when the first bombing run was called off because of bad weather. He is back today because Bradley's staff has told him that Cobra will start regardless. At 9:40 in the morning, the first wave arrives. 1,500 B-17s and B-24s. Above them, another 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers. Below them, the Panzer Division, dug into the earth south of the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. Between them and the target, less than a mile of open ground where American infantry and their commanders wait in shallow holes scraped from Norman clay. The plan is straightforward. The bombers will approach parallel to the front. They will drop their loads on the German side of the road. The Americans will crawl out of their trenches, and they will walk into the crater. It does not work that way. The wind is wrong. The smoke from the first bombs drifts north, back over the American lines, and each successive wave of bombers, seeing only smoke and the dust, they release their loads short, bomb after bomb, wave after wave. For nearly an hour, the ground behind the American lines heaves and cracks open, as if some vast animal were trying to claw its way up out of the earth. When it is over, 111 American soldiers are dead. Nearly 500 more are wounded. Some of the survivors say later that the dead had pink faces because the shockwave killed them before the shrapnel did. Their bodies never had time to lose color. Leslie McNair is one of the dead. The bomb that killed him fell directly into his slit trench. When American engineers reach the crater afterward, it is more than 10 feet deep. They identify what remains of him by the 3 silver stars on his collar and a ring from his years at West Point. He is the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat in the entire war. He is killed by his own Air Force. In the war, he helped design. The news does not travel fast. Bradley orders it kept quiet. The Germans have been told that McNair is commanding the fake 1st U.S. Army Group in England, a phantom force meant to convince Hitler that the real Allied invasion is still coming somewhere near Calais. If they learn he is dead in Normandy, the deception dies with him. So he is buried in Normandy American Cemetery under a stone that says only what a stone in that place ever says. His family in Washington is told not to speak of it. The doctrine he built does not die with him. Doctrines almost never do. They outlive the men who wrote them, carried forward by the officers who trained under them, by the manuals that quote them, by the institutional certainty that once a thing has been decided, it need not be decided again. But the man himself is gone. And the 90mm gun that his certainty had held at arm's length for 2 years is, on the very afternoon of his death, being lifted onto the deck of a Liberty ship in Baltimore, bound for the port of Cherbourg. The story does not turn on his death alone. It never does, but something changes in Washington after July 25th. Something quiet. The proposal that had gone sideways for 18 months begins at last to move forward. Ordnance officers who had been overruled find themselves unoverruled. Deliveries that had been queued behind training schedules begin to move, and the M36 tank destroyer, standardized in June, is at last permitted to sail. That vehicle had been a long time coming. In October 1942, 3 months after the 90 was first considered for anti-tank work, engineers in the Ordnance Department began the design of a new turret. The Sherman turret would not hold the gun. Neither would the standard M10 turret, already carrying the smaller 3-inch weapon. What they built instead was heavier, larger, with a squared-off bustle at the rear to counter the weight of the long barrel out front. The turret was left open at the top. A closed turret would have added more than 2 tons of weight, and the chassis was already near the limit of what its engine and suspension could carry. So the crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, assistant driver, would sit exposed to shrapnel and rain, and the occasional grenade dropped from an upper-story window. That was the price, the benefit, on paper. Was a weapon that could reach out and threaten the frontal armor of even the heaviest German tanks at ranges no earlier American vehicle could manage. The first prototype was designated T-71. It was completed in March 1943 at the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan, a sprawling plant run by the Fisher Body Division of General Motors. It was tested at Ardennes Proving Ground the following month. Against the test plates set up on the range, the 90 did exactly what its designers hoped. 5 inches of armor, 6 inches, 7. Each plate in turn gave way, the observers noting the results in careful columns of numbers that read on paper like a solved problem. Whether that same performance would hold true against the actual face-hardened front of a German heavy tank in the actual weather of a real battlefield was a question the range at Aberdeen could not yet answer. Steel behaves differently in a warm testing shed in Maryland than it does on a frozen hillside in Belgium. And no proving ground, however careful, can fully substitute for the war itself. In November 1943, the T-71 was accepted for limited procurement. In June 1944, days after the Normandy landings, it was standardized. The formal designation became the 90mm gun motor carriage M36. The Ordnance Department, casting about for a nickname to please the newspapers, called it the Jackson after Stonewall Jackson. The name did not stick with the crews. To them, it was simply the 90. Production climbed slowly through the spring and summer. Fisher Body built the hulls. Massey Harris and American Locomotive assembled additional vehicles. The chassis came from Montreal. By August 1944, more than 400 M36s had come off the assembly lines, but almost none of them had left the United States. They were still waiting for training programs to be written, still waiting for ammunition supplies to be built up in Europe, still waiting for someone with the authority to move them. McNair was already in the ground at Normandy American Cemetery. The institution he had shaped did not disappear with him. But the last of the resistance did. The first M36s reached the European theater in the final week of September 1944. They came off cargo ships at Cherbourg and Antwerp, and moved forward by rail and by truck convoy, distributed in small numbers to tank destroyer battalions that had been fighting since the beaches with the M10 Wolverine. The crews who received them noticed at first how little had changed. The hull was the same, the tracks were the same, the driver's compartment felt exactly as it always had. Only the turret was different, larger, squarer, and the barrel projecting from it was longer and thicker than the gun they had been firing for months. Oars distributed with these deliveries, through First Army Ordnance channels, carried a consistent instruction. Engage enemy heavy armor at maximum effective range. Do not let the Germans learn what they are now facing. Training was brief. There was no time for anything else. A handful of rounds fired at wrecked German hulls dragged to the edge of a field, a few practiced traverses of the new turret, a short briefing on the new ammunition, and then back to the line. Some of the men climbing into these vehicles had been driving M10s since Utah Beach. Their faces were already weathered by a summer and autumn of living inside cold steel and worse memories. Others were replacements straight off the boat, who had never sat inside any armored vehicle at all. Boys in clean uniforms standing next to men who had stopped bothering to keep theirs clean months earlier. To a veteran crew, the difference between the old gun and the new one seemed, at first, almost too small to matter. 90 millimeter. Right there, an instructor would say, pointing plainly at the new barrel. A few of the men laughed, the kind of tired laugh that comes from men who have heard too many promises. They had spent 4 months learning in the worst possible way that their guns could not kill what was hunting them. Watching friends die in the same hedgerows week after week, while the Army insisted the equipment was adequate. The idea that the Army had finally produced something different felt, on first hearing, like one more rumor in a war already full of them. It would take a battlefield, not a briefing, to convince them. The exact details of the very first M36 kill in Western Europe are not recorded with any real certainty. This has to be said plainly. Battalion logs from October 1944 are incomplete. Many of the men who might have described that first engagement in detail did not live to be asked about it after the war. What can be said with confidence is this. Somewhere in the rolling ground east of the German border in the last days of October 1944, an American tank destroyer crew found itself watching a column of German armor advancing through open country at a range that in every previous month of the campaign would have been a waste of ammunition. The platoon held its fire until the range closed to something over 1,000 yards, farther than any American gun had reasonably been expected to matter. And this time, when the shell arrived, the German tank did not simply keep moving. It stopped. Smoke began to climb from it into the gray autumn sky. Nobody in that battalion, in that regiment, in that division had done this before. The arithmetic of the war, the quiet calculation every American crew carried into every engagement about what their gun could and could not do at what range, had just changed. And it had changed on a single ordinary afternoon that a deadline would ever mark. For 4 months, these men had been taught to think of range as a limitation, a distance beyond which their weapons simply had nothing useful to say. Now, for the first time, it was something closer to an advantage, and it would take weeks for that lesson to spread fully through the ranks of men still climbing into M10s that had not yet been replaced. On the German side of the line, in a headquarters far removed from the smoking wreck itself, the loss was recorded, filed, and explained the way losses had always been explained. A tank had been destroyed by fire from a concealed position. There was no clear indication of what had actually killed it. This is the second turn in the story, and in some ways the strangest. For nearly 10 weeks, from the last days of October through the middle of December, M36 tank destroyers scattered along the front destroyed German armor at ranges the German army had considered safe, and German military intelligence did not notice. Or, more precisely, it noticed the losses but could not identify what was causing them. The German staff officers at the front had many things on their minds in the autumn of 1944. Their homeland was under nightly bomber attack from the west. Their army was under attack from the east by Soviet armies, larger than any force in the west had ever seen. Their railroads were disintegrating. Their fuel supplies were disintegrating. Their trained officer corps was disintegrating. A single technical assessment of a single American vehicle was a very small piece of paper to move through a very large and very broken bureaucracy. Reports of American tank destroyers appearing at unexpected ranges came in. They were logged. They were attributed to what German experience had always attributed such losses to: concealed anti-tank guns, artillery firing on a flat trajectory, bad luck. The reports moved up the chain the way military reports always did, slowly through overworked staff officers, sometimes lost in transit, sometimes overwritten by more urgent traffic. Whatever picture German intelligence held of American equipment in the autumn of 1944, it was built on information that was already out of date by the time it reached anyone positioned to act on it, the Americans. For their part, worked hard to keep it that way, and for a while they succeeded, but not entirely. In late October or early November of 1944, in a shattered village along the German frontier whose name has not survived in the surviving records, a German engineer team came upon a knocked-out American tank destroyer. This happened more than once. American vehicles were lost every day, and the German army had teams whose job was to walk out into the wreckage, measure what they found, and write down what it meant. This particular team did what every team did. They measured the bore of the gun. The number they wrote down was 90 millimeters. They filed a report. The report described a new American tank destroyer, apparently mounting a heavy anti-aircraft caliber gun on what appeared to be the modified chassis of the older M10. Ammunition was found in the vehicle. Some of it was undamaged. The stencils were photographed. The evidence was overwhelming and complete. The report entered the German military postal system, and then it disappeared. Not lost, not destroyed. Simply moved from one desk to another, then to another, then to another, in a bureaucracy that in the autumn of 1944 was headquartered in a city under nightly bombardment. Every desk had a stack of urgent papers on it. Every officer had 10 more urgent problems than the one described in front of him. A technical report about a single American tank destroyer, however alarming its conclusions, was in that autumn one of the smallest fires in a building already burning. The report would eventually reach the men who needed it. It would arrive after the battle that made it matter. Most had already been lost. Because before the report could complete its journey through the German bureaucracy, before panzer commanders at the front could be warned about what they might now be facing, the German army launched the largest offensive in the West it would ever launch. And it launched it directly at the sector where those M36s were quietly, without announcement, waiting, 16th of December, 1944. 5:30 in the morning, an unnatural quiet has settled over the Ardennes forest for 6 weeks. The American divisions holding that stretch of line are, in different ways, not the Army's strongest. Some, like the 28th Infantry Division, have been ground down elsewhere and sent to a quiet sector to recover. Others, like the 106th, have only just arrived from the United States and have never seen a German soldier. The tank destroyer battalions scattered along that front are a similar mix. Hardened veterans and newly arrived crews. Some still driving the old M10. Some now carrying the 90. On the other side of that quiet line, hidden by fog and strict radio silence, the largest armored force Germany will assemble in the West for the rest of the war is moving into position. Among the spearhead units are tanks that, even by the standards of 1944, are considered monstrous. King Tigers, 68 tons each. Frontal armor nearly 6 inches thick and steeply sloped. Mounting a long 88mm gun, capable of killing almost anything the Allies have ever built, at almost any range an Allied vehicle can return fire. The men commanding these tanks have every reason, based on everything they have been told, to believe they are driving the most dangerous vehicles on the continent, immune to anything an American crew can put in front of them. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, more than 2,000 German guns open fire along an 85-mile front. 90 minutes later, the barrage lifts, and the tanks begin to roll southeast of that advance at a crossroads town called St. Vith. 5 roads meet. In the kind of war the German planners are trying to fight, a war built entirely on speed and momentum, those 5 roads mean almost everything. Without St. Vith, the German timetable comes apart. With it, armored columns can pour west in a flood no thin American defense can hope to contain. By the morning of December 17th, German armor is already driving hard for the town. The Americans defending it are patchwork. The 106th Infantry Division, brand new to combat, is already being enveloped in the Schnee Eifel to the east. Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, under Brigadier General Bruce Clark, is racing south from the 9th Army sector to reinforce. A combat command of the 9th Armored Division is coming in from the south, and attached to the 7th Armored Division's defense, dug in among its tanks and armored infantry, is Company A of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The 814th's crews carry a mix of vehicles. Not all of them are M36s, not by any means. The re-equipment has been slow. Some platoons are still on the M10. Others have received the new 90 within the last few weeks. Nobody has fired the gun in a real engagement long enough to trust it completely. But they have it. And in the days that follow, they will use it. The fighting at St. Vith holds for 6 days against a German timetable that has allowed for 2. No single weapon breaks the German offensive by itself. Fuel runs short. American reinforcements converge from every direction. The weather, which has grounded Allied aircraft since the opening hours of the attack, finally clears. And when it does, American fighter bombers fall on the stalled German columns like something dropped from a great height. Snow falls over the town for most of that week, thick enough to muffle the sound of engines until they are almost on top of the American positions. And the men holding the line sleep, when they sleep at all, in the frozen cellars of houses whose owners have fled days earlier. But St. Vith is where the German offensive first begins to come apart. And among the weapons that buy those 6 days, firing from behind snowbanks and along tree lines and from the corners of stone barns, are the long-barreled tank destroyers of the 814th, carrying a gun the Germans do not yet know exists. Further north, along a parallel road that runs through the Amblève River Valley, another German column is trying to reach the Meuse River. Its commander is an SS Lieutenant Colonel named Joachim Peiper. He is 29 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, regarded within his own organization as a rising star. A man used to being told that the vehicles under his command cannot be stopped by anything the enemy possesses. Attached to his column in a heavy SS Tank Battalion designated SSSPZ, Apt 501, are King Tigers. The commander of that battalion is Obersturmbannführer Heinz von Westernhagen, 33 years old, still suffering headaches from a head wound taken in Russia the year before, the kind of injury that might have ended another officer's frontline service. He has been advised to take medical leave. He has not taken it. Whatever pain he carries in his skull that winter, he carries it into the turret of a King Tiger anyway. Peiper's column carries about 4,800 men and 600 vehicles. Its assignment is to punch west, cross the Meuse, and reach Antwerp within 4 days. On paper, it is one of the most powerful armored forces Germany has ever fielded in the West. For the first day, it looks unstoppable. By December 17th, Peiper is deep behind American lines. American prisoners taken along the way at a place called Ardennes are shot on the road in what becomes known as the Malmedy Massacre. Not a battle, an execution. 84 American soldiers, disarmed and standing in a field, gunned down where they stand. The news of what happened at Ardennes travels ahead of Peiper's column faster than his tanks can move. And the American units in his path begin to fight harder, longer, and with less willingness to consider surrender than any German commander in the West had thought possible only days before. On December 18th, at Stavelot, an American engineer battalion blows a bridge in Peiper's face. On December 19th, at Stoumont, elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the same old Hickory Division that had held the line at Mortain 4 months earlier, block his advance again. By December 20th, a task force of the 3rd Armored Division has broken through and blocked the N33 road north of Trois Ponts. Peiper's route to the Meuse is closed. His route back to the German lines is closing, and his fuel gauges are dropping toward empty with no resupply in sight. His men give the pocket a name. The cauldron for 4 days, the cauldron shrinks. American infantry closes from the north. American armor closes from the south. American artillery falls on the villages of L'Église and Stoumont and Chenot day and night, from every direction, in every caliber. And on December 23rd, when the weather at last clears, American fighter bombers come down on the trapped column in waves. Rockets, heavy bombs, strafing runs that leave long lines of spent shell casings glittering in the snow between the houses, the tanks parked in the narrow streets of L'Église. Tanks that had been built to dominate open country become easy, motionless targets in a place they can no longer move through. On the night of December 23rd into 24th, with fuel exhausted and no path left to withdraw his vehicles, Peiper gives the order: abandon the column, break out on foot. The wounded will stay behind. So will a rearguard of about 127 men, whose job is to blow up the abandoned equipment at intervals so the explosions sound like American shell fire. At 2 in the morning, Roughly 800 men of what had begun the offensive as a force of 3,000 slip out of La Glaise in a long, silent column. They cross a footbridge over the Amblève, near the railway viaduct at Lavenne. Their commanders walk down the row of men, speaking quiet words of courage. The password is, "Merry Christmas." Behind them, in the streets of La Glaise, sit some 135 vehicles, 6 King Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, assault guns, anti-aircraft mounts. Most of them are undamaged. They are simply out of fuel. One of the King Tigers left behind is Tank 213, commanded that day by Obersturmführer Wilhelm Dollinger. He had taken it over when his own vehicle had broken down. Now it sits in an alley beside the main road with a full crew compartment and an empty tank. Von Westernhagen escapes on foot with the rest of the column, carrying whatever remains of the headaches that have never left him since Russia. The cauldron is over. Not because German armor was defeated by American armor in the field. In many of the engagements around La Glaise, the Panthers and King Tigers were not penetrated from the front. In some cases, they were not seriously damaged at all. They were beaten by geography, by artillery, by air power, and above all by an American industrial system that could get fuel to its own tanks and could deny fuel to the enemy's. But scattered through the 10 days of the offensive, in the hedgerows outside St. Vith, in the roadblocks north of Mannheim, in the retaken streets of the villages that lay in Pieper's path, was a weapon the German army had spent 3 months failing to understand. It killed Panthers that had seemed untouchable in the summer. It forced King Tigers, tanks built to dominate every battlefield they entered, to maneuver and hesitate and sometimes retreat. Not because their armor had been breached from the front. In most cases, it had not. But because the range at which an American gun could now threaten them had changed. And no German crew commander could be certain anymore exactly how far that threat reached. Somewhere behind the lines, in a bureaucracy that had never yet caught up to the war, the report of the German engineer team that had measured a captured M36 was still working its way from desk to desk, still moving, still not read by anyone who could act on it. Christmas Eve, 1944, Mannheim, Belgium, 20 miles to the south of La Glaise. Along the main road running from Bastogne to Liège, another crossroads has become a killing ground. 2 roads meet at Mannheim. A third runs to Grandmesnil, half a mile to the west. These roads matter for the same reason all roads in the Ardennes have mattered that December. They lead somewhere. They are open. And whoever holds them controls what moves through this piece of the map for the next 24 hours. The Germans want them. The Americans have been ordered to hold them. By the afternoon of December 24th, the American units in and around Mannheim are a mixed patchwork. Elements of the 7th Armored Division, pulled back from St. Vith the day before, are trying to reorganize on the run. A task force built around the 3rd Armored Division's forward elements is holding pieces of the line to the west, and attached to that task force, dug in wherever the ground allowed, are the tank destroyers of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. The 703rd is not new to the war. It landed in France on July 1, 1944. It fought through Cobra. It reached the German border by September, and on September 30th, one of its companies traded in its M10s for the new M36. Only weeks before the offensive began, by the middle of December, the 703rd is one of the few tank destroyer battalions in the American Army, with any real experience firing the 90mm gun in combat. On the morning of December 16th, the first day of the German offensive, an M36 of the 703rd sat parked on a road near the village of Malempre, a few miles from Mannheim. There is a photograph of it. The barrel is long enough that it appears too heavy for the vehicle carrying it. The crew looks tired, the way men look tired in old photographs. The way tired seems to have been permanent in that place and that winter. That photograph was taken hours before the artillery opened up 85 miles to the east, and the war on the Western Front changed shape overnight by Christmas Eve. That same battalion is fighting to keep Mannheim open. On the night of December 24th, an SS armored column pushes through the town and into Grandmesnil, driving back the American force, holding it in a confused night action, fought as much by instinct as by any clear picture of where the front line actually runs. Panthers move up the road under starlight, so faint the American gunners can only fire at engine noise. The American crews inside their M36s worked the same rhythm the tank destroyer doctrine had always promised on paper: fire from concealment. Displace before the German column can locate the muzzle flash. Fire again from a different position. It is the doctrine McNair wrote in 1941. And for the first time, in the hands of a gun that could actually deliver it, it is beginning to work the way he imagined. Some of the M36s are lost that night. Their open turrets and thin side armor are still a real vulnerability at close range. The men inside are exposed to the same shrapnel and small arms fire that has always made this vehicle a dangerous place to sit once the enemy closes the distance. One of them ends the fight nose down in a ditch by the side of the road, its gun still elevated, its crew unaccounted for in the confusion of the retreat. A photograph exists of that vehicle too, being pulled out of the ditch some days later by American recovery crews. But they kill Panthers and assault guns in numbers the German commanders on the receiving end find difficult to explain. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the fight for Grandmesnil continues in freezing fog. Neither side sleeps. On December 26th, after American aircraft finally batter the German positions from the air, the village is retaken. The Battle of the Bulge is not decided by any single gun. It is decided by fuel that runs out, by weather that finally clears, by reinforcements converging faster than the German planners believed possible, by an American industrial base that could replace a burned-out Sherman in a way German industry, by December of 1944, no longer could. But scattered through that decision, in the hedgerows outside St. Vith and the retaken streets of Grandmesnil, was a weapon the German army still did not know it was facing. Paper's men, meanwhile, are walking, 800 of them, out of the 3,000 who started the offensive 9 days earlier, slipped through the woods east of L'Église on Christmas morning. They ford the Somme River in the dark. They pass American positions they cannot see and cannot afford to be seen by. Some of them freeze along the way. Some of them are shot. Most of them reach the German lines near Wanne by the first light of Christmas Day. Pieper is among the survivors. He is 29 years old. He walks into the German lines wearing the uniform of an officer who has just lost most of his command in a snow-filled valley in Belgium and knows he will spend the rest of his life explaining it. Somewhere behind him in L'Église, King Tiger 213 sits in an alley beside the town hall, its fuel tank empty, its crew gone. It will still be sitting in that alley in 1951, when a Belgian woman named Madame Guénon barters with American authorities to keep it in the village as a war memorial. It is still there today. Pieper does not know yet what will happen to him. He does not know that in 18 months, he will be standing in a military courtroom at Dachau, on trial for what his men did to American prisoners at a road junction called Ardennes on December 17, 1944. He does not know that he will be sentenced to death. He does not know that the sentence will be commuted. He does not know that he will spend nearly 11 years in Landsberg prison and be released, quietly, in December 1956. He does not know that he will settle in a small French village called Treves in the Haute-Saône, working as a translator, keeping mostly to himself. He does not know that on the night of July 14, 1976, Bastille Day, someone will set fire to his house and that his body will be found in the ruins. He will be 61 years old on that night. The same age McNair was when a bomb fell into his slit trench in Normandy. The war that made him at 29 one of the most feared armored commanders in the West will not let go of him. Not in the snowbound Belgian forest, not in the courtroom at Dachau, not in a quiet French village 3 decades later. In the end, it will follow him to his own front door. But that is 1976. In the first weeks of January 1945, another figure in this story is also walking toward his end. Heinz von Westernhagen, commander of SSSPZ, Apt 501, escaped from L'Église on foot with the rest of Pieper's men. His King Tigers were gone. His battalion was gone as a fighting force. He carried the same headaches out of Belgium that he had carried into it, the same head wound from the summer of 1943 that had left him by the account of his own family, unable to sleep, unable to eat, forced to be flown back to Berlin at intervals for medical treatment he could not afford to take. He remained in command through the spring. What was left of SSSZ Abt 501 was pulled out of the West and sent to Hungary, to the last great German counteroffensive of the war, an operation aimed at the oil fields around Lake Balaton. It failed within days. By the middle of March, the remnants of the battalion were falling back through western Hungary toward the Austrian border, fighting Soviet armor now instead of American. On March 19, 1945, near the city of Veszprém, Westernhagen received an order relieving him of command and reassigning him to the officer reserve. His replacement, Sturmbannführer Heinz Kling, was already on his way. Later that day, Westernhagen was dead. The official report said he had been killed by an aircraft bomb while traveling to his new assignment. The report was written the way such reports were always written, in a form of language designed to close a file rather than open a question. The truth, as reconstructed after the war by the German historian Wolfgang Schneider and by members of Westernhagen's own family, was simpler and harder. He had shot himself with his own pistol. Whether from despair over his relief from command, or from the accumulated weight of the head injury he had never been allowed to recover from, or from some combination that no one alive can now separate cleanly, the record does not settle. He was 33 years old. He is buried at Veszprém. His wife was pregnant when he died. His daughter would never meet him. That same week, somewhere in a headquarters on the eastern side of a retreating German line, an intelligence officer finally read a report he should have been given in October. It had taken its time arriving. Written by an engineer team that had measured a knocked-out American tank destroyer by hand, it had moved by truck, then by rail, then by another truck. It had sat for days at a stretch in waiting rooms in a capital under nightly bombardment. Berlin. By the time it reached the front, the war it described was already 3 months old, but its conclusion was no longer in doubt. The American vehicle carried a 90mm gun. Not the 76 the files had insisted on for months. A bulletin went out to the surviving Panzer formations. Engagement ranges were to be adjusted. American tank destroyers were to be presumed capable of reaching out much farther than German doctrine had assumed. The instruction was sound. It reached men who, by that point, had very little armor left to apply it with. The Ardennes offensive had ended in the last days of January, with the German salient pushed back to roughly where it had started. At a cost in tanks and trained crews, the German army could not replace. Roads that had carried columns of King Tigers and Panthers 6 weeks earlier now carried only the wreckage of them. Hulks half buried in thawing mud, waiting for recovery crews that would never come by March. Whole German divisions existed mostly on paper. Volkssturm units of reservists in their 50s and teenagers, barely old enough to shave manned lines that a year earlier had been held by hardened panzer crews. The Rhine had been crossed at Remagen on March 7th, when a forward detachment of the 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Railway Bridge still standing and rushed it under fire before the German engineers could complete their demolition. The bulletin warning about the 90mm M36 was correct in every technical detail. It had simply been written 3 months too late to save the men it was meant to warn. This is the story of the M36 as the men who lived through it. But it is not the whole story. 2 things need to be said plainly before the credits roll. 2 things that change the shape of everything that came before. The first concerns the gun itself. In the years after the war, when ordnance officers compared the technical penetration tables for the 90mm M3 gun against the actual armor of a King Tiger, the picture that emerged was less dramatic than the battlefield legend that grew up around it. The standard armor-piercing round fired by the M36 could defeat roughly 5 inches of sloped armor at 500 yards. A little less at 1,000, considerably less than that at longer ranges, the frontal glacis plate of a King Tiger, however, was thick enough and angled steeply enough that no reliable, well-documented case exists of an M36 penetrating it head-on in combat at any range, including the 3,000 yards sometimes claimed in retellings of this story. That number, 3,000 yards, is a piece of legend. It should be corrected in the telling. What the 90mm gun could do, and did do, again and again through the autumn and winter of 1944, was threaten the sides and rear of German heavy tanks at ranges between 800 and 1,500 yards. Distances where German crews had been trained to believe they were completely safe from anything the Americans owned. It forced King Tigers, tanks built to dominate a battlefield head-on, to instead maneuver, to expose flanks, to hesitate before advancing into open ground. That is a quieter victory than the popular story tells. but it is the one supported by the evidence, and it was still enough to change the outcome of several critical battles in a single winter. The second thing concerns the men who used the weapon. In 1946, the Army's armored school at Fort Knox gathered lessons learned from the European campaign, interviewing surviving tank destroyer crews, comparing their experiences with the M36 against the earlier, lighter M18 Hellcat, which carried a smaller 76mm gun but could move at nearly twice the M36's top speed. According to those post-war reports, a good number of the men who had crewed both vehicles said, when asked plainly, that they preferred the M18. It was faster, harder to hit, easier to escape in the moments right after a shot was fired, when a German gun crew somewhere in the trees was already swinging its own barrel toward the muzzle flash. The M36 hit harder. But the M18 got you home more often, and in the kind of war these men were actually fighting, a war of ambush and quick displacement and constant fear of the next unseen gun, speed sometimes mattered more than power. This is not the version of the story that gets told most often. The popular version says the bigger gun won the war, that every extra inch of penetration brought the men home faster, that the M36 was an unambiguous triumph celebrated by everyone who rode inside one. The men who actually crewed these vehicles, when they spoke honestly after the war, described something more complicated. They wanted to survive more than they wanted to win decisively. They would have traded raw power for speed in plenty of situations without a second thought. More than one veteran interviewed in later years admitted as much without any apparent embarrassment about it. History retold enough times tends to keep the part of the story that sounds best and quietly drops the part that sounds merely true. The men who lived through it were rarely the ones telling the more heroic version. They mostly just went quiet when they heard someone else tell it that way, letting the legend stand because correcting it seemed like too much effort for too little reward. By May of 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the M36 had accounted for a substantial number of German armored vehicles destroyed on the Western Front. Though most King Tiger losses in the West came from fuel exhaustion, mechanical failure, and air attack rather than from direct armor combat, the exact figures on both sides remain estimates rather than settled counts, drawn from incomplete wartime records. It was a small contribution set against the vastly larger tank losses Germany suffered on the Eastern Front against Soviet armor, where the true weight of German tank casualties had always fallen most heavily, but on the Western Front. In the specific months between October 1944 and the end of the Ardennes fighting, it was the one weapon that let American crews finally stand their ground against tanks that had, for the first 4 months of the campaign, seemed almost impossible to stop. For the infantrymen who had watched Shermans burn all summer with nothing they could do about it, that alone was worth more than any precise final tally could measure. The M36 remained in American service for years after the war ended. It saw brief further use during the opening phase of the Korean War before newer designs replaced it entirely. Its long barrel by then already looked like a relic from an older kind of fighting, but its real legacy belongs to that one narrow window in late 1944, when a gun built by accident to shoot at the sky was turned instead toward the ground. And for 10 weeks, an army that had spent months learning to fear German armor quietly, without announcement, without any German officer fully understanding what had changed, began to fight back on something closer to even terms. The King Tiger commanders who died that winter never learned the name of the vehicle that killed them. Their own intelligence service did not know it existed until the war that made it matter was already lost. That, more than any single number on a range card, is the story worth remembering. Not because the gun was perfect, it was not. And not because every shot fired from it found its marks at some impossible distance. Most did not. But because for one difficult winter, in a narrow corridor of forest and snow between the German border and the Meuse River, it was simply there, when nothing else American had been.